Okay, everybody, we had some audio issues in the recording of our actually throughout the whole thing for everybody with feedback and such because I didn't have the system on lecture mode. So we're going to re-record last night's session for about Isaac and Jacob right now, and hopefully the audio and everything will be better. This is, of course, the God is Good course. This is session number 5. We're looking at Isaac and Jacob today, mostly. And by the way, as it turned out last night, we didn't get all the way through the slides. So we will do the same amount of material in this re-recording, go to that same slide that we stopped on last night, and then stop, and we'll pick up again next week, or actually 2 weeks from today. As usual, the Rational Bible by Dennis Prager, the book of Genesis for now and later Exodus, is the primary source material or quote unquote textbook for this class. In it, he acknowledges all the sources he used. I'm also here listing Sefaria.org as the source of the Bible translation that I use for the slides that you see on the screen, and we read most of them probably. It's the closest translation to what Prager uses in his book. So that's why. I looked at a thing called PragerTopia.com today. It's a service that Prager makes available. It costs $10 a month. I think you have to buy it a year at a time. And it has all this audio stuff, podcast, talk show. I don't know, it's a lot of stuff in there. But the thing I was mostly interested in is it has an audio library of all his lectures on the Torah, verse by verse, all the way through Genesis, from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they were all recorded several years ago, many years ago. His voice was young enough I didn't recognize it at first. So it's not a duplicate copy, you might say, of the current books that he has out, Rational Bible, Genesis through, well, eventually through Deuteronomy. It's all his lectures from X years ago, verse by verse on those things. And I listened to the one covering the same material that we're going to cover this time, and I was amazed at how much different it was. The big picture was the same, but the details, the verse by verse, it's even more detailed than the book, it seems to me, or he covers different details. The big picture is the same, like I said. 241 hours, almost 199 lectures. We'll be listening to that for a long time. In fact, we're taking a trip to Omaha this coming week, or this week, and I think we will be listening to a lot of those lectures, hopefully. You can also buy them if you want your own copy of the whole library of those Genesis through Deuteronomy lectures. You can buy it for like $500 or $600 per book, I think was the prices I saw. It's pretty outrageous. You can get it on CD, a USB stick, download it, that kind of thing. But if you're willing to just stream it, it's only $10 a month. So there you go. All right, this slide doesn't have any particular bearing on any particular spot of where we are, but I want to make the point here before we get going that families are messy, and everybody who's been a member of a family, which I assume almost all of us are, realize that it's full of drama. There's deceit, there's lying, there's feelings, there's all kinds of stuff that mess things up. What I want to point out here is that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, are very real about that. Dysfunctional families abound in the Torah. And we're going to see some of that today. We've already seen some of that in previous sessions. Even so, the marriage and family are still the likely to lead to the most fulfilling life. So, off and running. This is chapter 21, the first 3 verses. The Lord took note of Sarah as he had promised, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. At the set time God had spoken. Abraham gave his newborn son, whom Sarah had borne him, the name of Isaac. Notice at the beginning, Lord took note of Sarah. Abraham is not mentioned. And I point that out as one of the many times in the Torah you will find evidence of the fact that the Bible is not particularly sexist, which is a claim that's made in modern days all the time, particularly with feminism, such a hot thing. But the Bible is not sexist. If it were, the Lord wouldn't be taking note of Sarah. The Lord would be taking note of Abraham. Women were the ultimate portion of creation. They followed man as the height or the epitome or the last rung of the ladder in creation. There's one of the 10 commandments: honor your mother and father. Both of them, they're equal. On and on and on and on. You'll find examples of how the Bible is not sexist. Another little interesting note here: the name Isaac, the word Isaac in Hebrew means laugh, and it's a reference back to, if you remember from last time, when both Abraham and Sarah, individually and separately, laughed when they heard God say that they were going to have a son. This harkens back to that moment, or those moments. Okay, 21:12. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued for you." As best can be figured out, and it's not exact, Isaac here is about 2-year-old, and Ishmael is about 16 years old, or at least in the teenager kind of years, and Isaac is very young. And just to remind everybody, Sarah is Jacob's wife, who isn't having or can't have children apparently. So she has Isaac sleep with her maid to have a baby, a very common practice. Hagar is her name. So Hagar, by Abraham, has a son named Ishmael. Then later on, when God fulfills his promise to Sarah and Jacob to have a baby, they have a baby. His name is Isaac. So he's a kind of a half brother to Ishmael. Sarah is Isaac's mom. Hagar is Ishmael's mom. Jacob is both of their dads. So that's where we are. So Sarah sees the 2 of the boys at play and gets upset, worrying about who knows what exactly, but probably birthrights, because Isaac was the second born, which means Ishmael would be by normal practice, the legitimate heir to Jacob's wealth and so on. So Sarah gets upset, and she tells Abram to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. This is a good example of one of the most distressing things to a marriage is child rearing issues. And this becomes especially difficult, or more difficult, when there's a stepchild involved, which of course Ishmael is to Sarah. So Abraham was understandably distressed. It just sort of makes the whole family distressed. But God tells Abraham, side with Sarah. This is what you should do. Despite the nastiness she has, because basically this is part of God's plan, that Isaac will ultimately become the one who continues the line of Abraham on down through all the Israelites. So despite this all, God is telling Abraham here, just go along with Sarah. Do what Sarah wants. It's a little bit like a happy wife, happy life moment in their family as well. So Hagar and Ishmael get sent away. And interestingly enough, despite Abraham's wealth, he sent them away with very meager provisions. Why was that? Well, we don't know. Maybe he didn't want to upset Sarah with looking like he cared so much about Hagar and Ishmael, or maybe God told him that he would take care of them, and we don't know about that. Another thing we don't know why is while they're out there, they become desperate, so to speak, and Hagar leaves Ishmael under a bush and basically walks off. But they're both sort of wailing and crying out about their lot, and God hears that and saves the two of them in the wilderness at a place called Beersheba. Sometime afterward, meaning after those events, God put Abraham to the test. He said to Abraham, and he answered, "Here I am." Okay, here begins the big story. The story that is typically referred to, particularly in Christian churches or Christian circles, the sacrifice of Isaac. But that's actually not a particularly accurate translation of what happened even, as well as the words used in the Torah in Hebrew. Probably a better term, as Prager points out, would be the binding of Isaac. It's clear from the outset in this verse, right at the very beginning of this whole story, the phrase God put Abraham to the test. This is a test. This is only a test. For the next 60 seconds, we will be sending the signal to make sure everything works. We all know, and God makes it very clear from the start, he's not asking Abraham to actually kill his son. He is, but it's a test. It's not going to go as far as actually killing his son. God does not want any human sacrifice. Another interesting thing to look at here is the phrase "here I am." Literally translated from the Hebrew would be more like, "Yes, sir. What do you want me to do? Standing by for your command," kind of feel to it. So God told Abraham, "Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you." A number of little interesting things here to know. One you can't see in this translation, but God actually uses the word please, or the Hebrew word for please, which is na, in this. Please take your son. Please offer him as a burnt offering. It's a word that occurs a lot in Genesis, about 60 times, but only 5 other times in all of the Old Testament. And why is that? Well, because God does a lot of speaking to human beings in the in Genesis, these early stories, and usually when God uses that please, or we might think of it as pretty please phrase, it's when God is expressing that he knows his request is a staggering one. It's a big deal. He tells or asks Abraham to leave his father and venture out. That's a big deal. So that's an interesting thing about the use of the word "na" in there that you don't even see in the English translation. Why didn't he just say Isaac? That's another interesting ponderable. He goes that great length. Take your son, your favored one, the one you love, Isaac, and blah, blah, blah. Why doesn't he just say take Isaac? Well, it certainly makes the request harder or more difficult. He's adding drama, basically, to the story, driving home to Abraham how important Isaac is to him. And here is God asking him to sacrifice his son. Oh, and I should have mentioned when I mentioned earlier that Abraham was also asked to leave his father. The go command in here is the same word used back when God told Abraham to leave his father. An interesting other thing to note is that all of those bullet points, so to speak, that God uses to describe Isaac could also have been used to describe Ishmael. Ishmael was his son. He liked Ishmael, meaning he favored him. He was not disliked, and he loved him. He had no problem with Hagar and Ishmael. So why didn't he ask which son or which favored one? Or so I suppose the reason he didn't is because God did identify him. Take Isaac. So early the next morning, they're headed out. Why early the next morning? Why might that be important? Well, a number of things could be happening here. It's possible Abraham is just eager to perform God's commands. It's also even more likely, in my mind anyway, eager to get it over with. Maybe he couldn't sleep. Maybe it was as simple as not wasting daylight, a very common practice, particularly long ago. If you were traveling, you would leave it at the break of dawn or even earlier to make sure you maximize daylight. It also points to the fact that it was likely a dream through which Abraham was told by God to sacrifice Isaac when this test was set up. Moses, as we'll learn later, is the only character that had a face-to-face encounter with God, or at least in the Torah. And even that wasn't exactly face-to-face. I mean, Moses never actually saw him, but presumably he was there and in the present, much more than the dreams or visions or messengers. Why didn't Abraham argue with God about this, like he did with arguing with God about saving or not saving Sodom? Particularly when he understood, or should have remembered at least at this point, God's promise of forming a great nation through his descendants, through Isaac, presumably. How does this, he's confused. How does this work with that? I mean, if you kill my son or son, that's not going to work. But he didn't. He did not argue. Maybe Abraham was convinced that God was just, particularly based on the Sodom experience, and knows what's best for him. Sacrificing kids, by the way, wouldn't have been a huge... If somebody suggested that today, I mean, we would be so bowled over by the outrageousness of the proposition that we would start asking questions like crazy. But here, that's not, back in these days, that's not the case. Child sacrifice, human sacrifice in general, was very common in the ancients, particularly, the pagans, other religions, blah, blah, blah. So that wouldn't have jarred him all that much. In not fully understanding, this is one of those big picture things, in not fully understanding what's going on here, Abraham actually represents every believer who has come after him. We don't always understand exactly what's going on with God's requests or God's plan. Why sacrifice as the test in this story? Probably one of the, at least a rational reason, is to combat this the prevalence of human sacrifice in the day, or taking advantage of it. I'm not quite sure which way to look at it. God is asking Abraham basically, will you do for me what others do for their gods? You believing in me, the one true God, will you at least do for me what you do for the other pagan, quote unquote, nonsense gods, or what others do for them anyway. Another aspect of this is it's ultimately leading to a very clear message in the Torah that human sacrifice is a no-no. So this is another way to highlight the existence of that and the fact that God does not want it to happen. Another bigger message here is that good people do have to be prepared to sacrifice for the good. Probably the best modern example, at least the one that Prager offered, and I couldn't think of anything better. Parents sacrifice their children, or at least potentially sacrifice their children willingly, when they allow them to go off to fight a just war. They are doing good by doing that. War can be a moral good if you're fighting the right thing. So parents who send their kids off to do that at least put them in harm's way, if not actually sacrificing them in this true sense of the word, sacrifice, being killed. One of the questions that we ask, or has to be asked, is, will good people be as committed to good as evil people are committed to evil? That's a pretty important question. And I would say, in light of today's activities and happenings and events, it's a really good question. All right, moving on. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. There is no record of Abraham and Isaac talking at all during this presumably 3-day march to finding the place where Isaac is to be sacrificed. So what do you get out of that? You get the impression that it's silent resignation the whole time, particularly on Abraham's part, but Isaac is probably old enough to know what's going on, so maybe on his part too. Automaton kind of action, moving without really focusing on anything. Were they really out walking around hunting for this altar for 3 days? We don't know. But knowing the interesting use of numbers in the Torah and the Old Testament, for that matter, or the whole Bible, the reference to the third day is an expression that means something is big, something astonishing is happening. It's the same sort of 3-day reference of 3 days to the resurrection of Christ, would be the ultimate carry through for the Christians who go on through the New Testament. So it may not have been a literal 3 days. Or maybe it was a long time. Maybe God wanted to give Abraham plenty of time to think about this, roll it over in his mind, make the test even harder in the sense of giving him time to pull out of the deal, so to speak, change his mind. God wanted to see if he would stick to it. Another thing, it might have taken him a long time to figure out what the heck he was going to tell Sarah when he got home. If you can imagine going home to tell your wife that you just sacrificed their only son. Another thing that's interesting here is when Abraham looked up, he saw the place from afar. That might suggest that all this time, however many days, he was looking down, sort of as you would if you were totally depressed, you were walking along, not even paying attention to where you're going particularly, kicking pebbles as you go in a very depressed state. So all of that could be in play. This plus the next couple of verses is the only dialogue in the whole Torah between Abraham and Isaac. And here, at least in verse 7, he says, Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Where are the firestone and the wood?" I mean, here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? Again, this makes it pretty clear that Isaac is old enough to know what's going on. He was old enough to carry a load, the wood or some of the firestone, and he was old enough to know what a sacrifice was all about, and he didn't see the sheep around. Notice that Abraham speaks fairly gently and affectionately, which you would probably do too if you believe that these were the last moments that you and your son were going to have together. In the next verses, Abraham binds Isaac, puts him on the altar. Isaac apparently puts up no fight. He too is being obedient. And another interesting thing to point out here, and this is a thought that came from, just FYI, this is a thought that came from those old lecture tapes that I was listening to, not from the current Prager book that we're using, or at least I don't remember reading it in there. I might have missed it somehow, but it's pretty amazing. So if I'd have been paying attention at all, I would not have missed it. Anyway, there's an interesting comparison here. Isaac carried the wood to his sacrifice. At the end of Jesus's life on earth, Jesus carries the wood, i.e. the cross, to his sacrifice. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've never heard that put together before. I found that fascinating. Okay, verse 11 and 12. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" And he answered, "Here I am, yes, sir." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him." One thing to note here is that while it took God to convince Abraham to do this in the first place, or even set out to do this, it only took an angel to stop him. It probably, and you can imagine why, it probably wouldn't have taken much at all for him to be stopped. That's how much he didn't want to do it. And it's interesting too that even here the angel calls to Abraham twice, or uses his name twice, which makes sense. This is very urgent. If your kid was running into a pool and you saw it developing, you saw him running across the deck, you would probably yell his name 16,000 times by the time he got to the water. It's a natural instinct when something is extremely urgent. This is nearly identical, interestingly enough, to when the angel called to Hagar when Ishmael was saved. Both of Abraham's sons were threatened with death, one by Abraham and one by Hagar. And another thing that's common is the hold the hand image present in both stories. Both parents held the hand of their son. But again, the big picture here, human sacrifice is morally unacceptable. It's another unique Torah contribution to the time. At the time, like I said, human and child sacrifice was common. This was by far the most dramatic teaching about human sacrifice, but it does occur elsewhere in the Torah. The Torah makes it clear on more than one occasion that human sacrifice is a no-no, let alone child sacrifice. Verse 12, "For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." This is God, of course, speaking to Abraham. So it's over. God says, "Yep, you passed the test." And here you might stop and ask, why even have this test? Um, did God not know what Abraham would do anyway? It's one of the things you could ask. Prager and I agree that if you understand this notion of free will that God gave humans at creation, God may well not know where humans are going to go because humans have free will. Maybe this was to teach Abraham something. It seems unnecessary that he would need to do that because he was pretty clearly a righteous person, but maybe it's to teach readers of the story something. And that might be faith demands sacrifice. Not human sacrifice, of course, but some kind of sacrifice. And there are a number of religions that practice a ritual of deprivation, you might call it, to one degree or another. Lent, for instance, for the Christians is a time of giving up something, sacrificing. The Mormons give up the use of coffee and alcohol, and so on and so forth. To remind us, one of the points of these rituals is to remind us that God requires sacrifice to get things done. Given the history of the Jews, persecution of the Jews, every Jewish parent who raises a child in Judaism must realize the potential for her child to die prematurely simply because he's a practicing Jew. Whether or not sacrifice is moral or not depends on the situation. I hearken back to the example of sending children off to war. The question of whether that sacrifice is moral or not depends on whether or not it's a just war. Abraham is blessed. This is God speaking to Abraham after it's all over. I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. Abraham is blessed, of course. Before the first references to this blessing, he has promised descendants that number the stars. Now, sand grains on the beach have been added to the comparison, that you'll have as many descendants as there are sand grains on the beach. Certainly to the ancients, this would have been a huge upping of the ante, so to speak. In a nighttime dark sky, generally speaking, you might be able to see about 3,000 stars. On the other hand, and the ancients too. On the other hand, on the beach, counting sand grains, it very quickly becomes clear that there are far more than 3,000 sand grains on the beach. So the ancients would have been very impressed with this. So I looked around at some numbers. How many people have lived on the earth in all human time? Well, a number of people have studied this. There's kind of ranges of numbers, as you might imagine. But they seem to hover around like 108 billion humans have been born and lived at least some amount of time on the earth. 7.5 billion of those are alive today, which makes today's human population 7%, which I thought was amazingly high or interestingly high. 7% of all the humans that have ever lived on the earth. That's kind of a wow. I never really thought about that, I guess. So how about how many stars and how many sand grains for real? Well, again, the numbers will vary depending on what study you pick up and look at. But roughly the number of stars in the universe is about 10 to the 24th, which is 1 followed by 24 zeros. That's a lot more than a 100 billion or so. And give or take, a few zeros. The number of sand grains on the beach, interestingly enough, is not quite that much, hovering around or circling around an estimated number of about 10 to the 18th, which is 1 followed by 18 zeros. So not quite, but still staggering numbers. And interestingly enough, when you think of big numbers, it's too bad God didn't mention atoms, 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 because that would have been even a greater number when you think that there are as many atoms in a dust mite as there are stars in the universe, actually more. You start dealing with pretty staggering numbers, which is fun. I find that fun. Okay, and after all of this is done, Abraham then returned to his servants, and they departed together for Beersheba. Remember, there were two, we didn't talk about it here, but in the story, when Abraham takes Isaac out to do the sacrifice, he takes 2 servants with him. And there is supposed, we would understand that those servants have been traveling with them the whole time to get to where the sacrifice was to take place. Abraham tells those servants to stay behind, and then he goes on around the curve or up the hill or whatever to the altar to do the deed. Interestingly enough, I didn't mention this, but it is intriguing. When Abraham tells the servants to stay behind, he tells them that we will return, not I will return. And Prager has an interesting discussion about that too. Did Abraham really sense that this isn't going to happen? God is not going to make me do this. Or did he really sense that this is not going to happen? I'm not going to allow it. Or was he just being compassionate? He didn't want to stir up Isaac's Isaac's feelings too badly. So we're not sure what Abraham meant by we'll be right back, basically, but that is what he said. So anyway, so now we're understanding after this is all over, Abraham returns to his servants, and Abraham and his 2 servants, depart together for Beersheba, and that's where Abraham stayed. Well, what happened to Isaac? What about returning to where Sarah is? This is basically the end of Abraham's nuclear family. Isaac does not go with him. He does not return to Sarah. He will not see Sarah again until her death, basically. So again, this is not exactly a normal family. There's odd things going on, some of it clearly dysfunctional. The Torah does not back off from that. The Torah tells it like it is. Okay, so at this point in chapter 23, early on, Sarah has died, and she died at the age of 127, which is one of those biblical interesting numbers. It's 120, which was the lifespan maximum number of years that God set a while ago. We've already talked about that. Plus 7, which is that number that is often used to hearken back to the creation. It's like the most important historical reference, the number 7, telling everybody or reminding everybody of creation. The world was created in 6 days. On the 7th day, God rested. The 7 days of creation are critical to remember. That's the point. Here, we're at verse 4. I am a resident alien among you. Sell me a burial site among you, that I may remove my dead for burial. Sarah has died, and Abraham needs a burial plot for her. And he's in the land of Canaan, which is where God which is what God promised him. You might wonder, well, why isn't Abraham questioning God about, okay, where's my land? He didn't get given as much as a burial plot. Instead, Abraham had to buy it for himself to find a place to put Sarah to rest. What's the big picture here? What's the big lesson? The big lesson is God makes promises that man might have to help make happen. Abraham here is clearly helping God make happen the promise. But one of the things you have to remember in doing so is that you still are required to act decently. Just because you are doing God's plan does not mean you can act indecently. That is why Abraham made an offer. It was accepted. He bought the bird. He didn't take it. He didn't steal it. He didn't say this is mine because God said it's mine. None of that. He made a perfectly normal real estate transaction, at least for the day, meaning back in that day. Okay, here's a note. We're not going to cover chapter 24 much at all. We're going to do this one slide and leave it at that. You're certainly welcome to go back and look at it in detail. It's basically about finding a wife for Isaac, Rebecca being that ultimately the wife for Isaac. This is by far the longest chapter in Genesis, making it clear that it's more important to get married than to know how the world was created. It's usually significant when the Torah spends more time talking about something than something else. The bigger, longer talk something is more important. How potential spouses treat strangers, that's discussed in this book. That's a good clue. Whenever you're asked, what do I look for or watch for in a potential spouse? One of the things that Prager often suggests is watch how your potential partner treats strangers. Like, how does he or she treat the waiter at a restaurant? That person is obviously going to treat you well, so that's not a good way to look at it. To look at it a little crassly, they want something. They want to be boyfriend, girlfriend. They want to get married. They want something from you. But the waiter, how they treat the waiter, much more clear indication of their internal workings and how they deal with strangers. Focus on behavior, not intentions. We've talked about this before. Many people believe they are good. This is one of the things that distracts us from the first, is yourself. Many people believe that you yourself are good because you assess your intentions, not the results of what you do. That it's critical to force yourself or train yourself to assess the results of what you do, not the intentions you had in the first place. And Prager points out that there's three mirrors that you can use to look at yourself, to look at how you're doing. How do I stack up? One is a regular mirror. You see your face, you know it's me. That's me. Another is your writings. Your writings are a mirror into your mind. So if you keep a diary or write for whatever reason, that's a second mirror that you can use to kind of see into your mind. And the third mirror that Prager mentions is your friends. You see your own character by those you attract. In other words, if you're of good character, you tend to draw good people around you. And if you're not so good, you tend to draw not so good people around you. So who you surround yourself with can be a mirror into your character. At the end of this very long chapter about marriage, verse 67, we haven't had a number even close to that before. Isaac then brought her into the tent of his mother, and he took Rebekah as his wife. Isaac loved her, and thus found comfort after his mother's death. The first reference to love in the Torah was back in Genesis 22, where God describes Abraham's love, Abraham's love for Isaac. This is the second. The first one was a parent-son, a parent to a son relationship, and this one is a spouse to spouse relationship. The two greatest loves of our life, right? A spouse and children. And they're done in chronological order. You first have a relationship with parent, and then you have a relationship with your spouse. It's interesting, the order here. First, Isaac takes Rebekah as his wife, and then he loved her. It kind of reminds me actually of, remember in Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye and Golda, they do that song where they ask each other, if you love me, and Tevye says something to the effect, I guess after 25 years of marriage, I do. This is not all that unusual, even today. It's certainly not unusual in the past. When parents decided marriages or marriages happened like we've seen here, that they very fast. You meet who you want, you ask the father or the tribe or whatever if you can marry, you get married, and hopefully, and many do, learn to love each other. Even today, for one reason or another, couples can get married before they actually fall in love. That comes later after being married. So early in chapter 25, verse 8, Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. This is a fulfillment of one of God's promises. God promised Abraham that he would die content and happy, basically. He and Isaac, Abraham and Isaac, are the only two people in the Torah who die peacefully or are described as dying peacefully. Even Moses, who is arguably the biggest, most important character, does not die peacefully. It's rare. It's a rare thing. Even in life, out of all those 108 billion people, it's rare that you die peacefully, happy, contented. And remember, gathered to his kin. This is one of those Torah references to an afterlife. It's hard to imagine how one would be gathered to your kin. We're not talking about all being buried side by side. That obviously didn't happen. It would be hard to imagine how that could happen if there wasn't some sort of an afterlife. Some Christians believe in it, some don't. Some Jews believe in it, some don't. Like I said, the Torah does not make this explicitly clear. And you might wonder about that. If there is an afterlife, why wouldn't the Torah talk about it any more than it does? And certainly a rational answer to that question is, and I think God makes it pretty clear, what he's trying to do in the Torah is have you focus on making life here on earth good and fulfilling and all those wonderful things. Save the afterlife for later. I'm going to tell you in these 5 books what you need to do to be happy, fulfilled, etc. And we're not going to talk about anything that's distracting, which may have been sort of the attitude regarding the afterlife. What is clear, another thing that points to an afterlife, is that God promises to be just. God promises justice. And with all the world's human suffering, it's hard to imagine how every evil one who has caused that injustice or of human suffering, who goes unpunished in this life. If God really does fulfill his promises, there must be some kind of afterlife where those evil ones will get their comeuppance. If not, there's only really two choices here. There is an afterlife, and hopefully God is in control of that, or we simply return to dust, oblivion, and that is literally it. Okay, so here God is talking to Rebekah, who is Isaac's wife, right? And the Lord answered her, Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 separate peoples shall issue from your body. One people shall be mightier than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Rebekah is about to have her and Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau. Notice that God has not spoken this to Isaac. God is speaking only to Rebekah. She is being made privy to God's plan here to make the younger twin, who turns out to be Jacob, the conduit of Abraham's and Isaac's based monotheism system. And she will use this information later when she helps Jacob trick Isaac into giving Jacob the innermost blessing, the passing of the birthright, not Esau, who was the firstborn technically, and therefore technically should have received the Bible. This is another theme that continues throughout the Bible, and that is that the younger is often depicted as more worthy or chosen than the older. So while the status of the eldest son remains in the human world, it's a very common thing. A lot of us think of that as, oh, the eldest son, yeah, he's the one who's going to take on the dad's business or whatever it is. The Bible makes it pretty clear that that's not necessarily so, or it's certainly not necessarily right, that it's often the younger who is more capable, more worthy, blah, blah, blah. The age shouldn't matter, in other words. Here we get a little depiction of what the 2 boys were like. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the outdoors, but Jacob was a mild man who stayed in camp. Isaac, the dad, favored Esau because he had a taste for game. He liked meat. And that's worth remembering, where it'll come up here in a little bit, that's kind of important through this story. But it notes also that Rebekah favored Jacob. Why? Well, presumably because God told her that Jacob was the one who was going to carry on the descendancy. And just a note on hunting. Hunting is not outlawed in the Bible, nor is it promoted. It's certainly allowed for feeding, getting food, but it's not really talked about in the sense of a sport. So I would say that, and Prager I think would agree, that this is an area in the Torah at least that doesn't really say anything one way or the other. Prager has noted, and I would note the same, that I know great, wonderful, good, human, decent people who hunt, enjoy hunting, and I know those who don't want to hunt. There's an aversion to it for some reason or another. It's interesting to note that most good, decent people who hunt for sport also eat what they kill. And in fact, even sometimes use even more of the animal than just what can be eaten. So that would certainly tend to comply with biblical requirements regarding animals. The other big one, by the way, is preventing animal suffering. That is clearly a no-no in the Torah. So a good, decent hunter who chooses to involve himself in that sport, yeah, has to be focused on not having the animal suffer. It's got to be, quote unquote, the clean kill, or as quickly and cleanly as possible. Esau, leading up to this verse, has been out hunting, presumably, long time, enough to be tired and hungry when he gets home. And when he gets home, he says, Jacob, my brother, please give me something to eat. Jacob is there, presumably cooking something. And he's saying, I'm about to die practically. I'm so tired and hungry. And that's where we pick up here in verse 33. Jacob says to Esau, swear to me first. So Esau swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob then gave Esau bread and lentil stew, which is what Esau was clamoring for. He ate and drank, and he rose and went away. Thus did Esau spurn the birthright. A lot of people condemn Jacob to some degree or another for what they perceive as tricking Esau out of his birthright. Prager doesn't see it that way exactly. Jacob didn't do anything here that was wrong. He merely took advantage of an opportunity or saw an opportunity. He didn't force Esau to agree. He didn't lie or deceive. He simply saw maybe Esau would give up his birthright. He's so darn hungry, which he did. But again, he neither tricked, he didn't threaten. He simply saw an opening. And it's pretty clear that Esau accepted very willingly. And the word spurned, Esau spurned his birthright. That word from the Hebrew would probably be more accurately translated as despised. Esau despised his birthright. Another thing, this is God's plan. Jacob is supposed to get the birthright to pass on everything through all the descendancies of Abraham. So there's a lot of reasons that we shouldn't get too harsh about Jacob making this deal. Okay, so there was a famine in the land, and Isaac was headed to Egypt for food, or was about to head to Egypt for food, and the Lord stopped him. Chapter 26, verse 2, the Lord had appeared to him and said, do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land which I point out to you. This is another test, among other things. Will Isaac trust in God, have faith, quote unquote, in God? Here's a point where it could be made or reminded everybody. The Torah takes the existence of God as an assumption. How could it not, right? It's a little funny to even wonder about that. But what it does not take as an assumption, what it works to create is trust in God, the God that you supposedly believe in. Beyond believing in him that he exists, do you trust him? Do you follow his instructions? That's the important issue here. And in fact, as you might guess, Isaac does trust God and stays in the land where he is. He does not go to Egypt. I will make your heirs as numerous as the stars of heaven and assign to your heirs all these lands, so that all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your heirs. The Jewish purpose is to be a vehicle for God's blessing on the entire world, not just Israel, or not just the Jews, or not just the Hebrews, which all of those are. I don't remember exactly what order they come in. This is stated at least 5 times in Genesis alone, that God wants a people to bless all mankind. It's another Torah first. The other ancient histories, Bibles, instructions from other pagan gods and thoughts didn't ask their people to be a blessing to the whole world. They asked their people, at best, to be a blessing to their own nation. So one of the encounters Isaac has is with Abimelech, who was the king of Sodom, as I recall, when Isaac approached, came to town, so to speak, Abimelech, the king, charged all his people, saying, anyone who molests this man or his wife shall be put to death. Why did he have to do that? Well, he had to do that because strangers in ancient times were often treated very harshly or even killed when they showed up at a village or someplace, a tribe or clan that they were not part of. They were rarely treated well, that's for sure. What's the big issue here, or the big point? Well, it certainly raises a puzzle that many people have in life, especially today. How do you know when to trust a stranger or not? And Prager offers this suggestion. He says, if you're in a decent society, doesn't elaborate, at least here, about what a decent society is, but he talks a lot other places about decency and indecency. So if you want to really find out what he meant by that, you can. In decent societies, you can approach strangers optimistically unless they exhibit some bad characteristic, like speech or dress or from attitude or from behavior. In other words, unless you get some clue that would be reasonable to suggest, points out a not decent attitude. If you're in an indecent society, it's best to be wary. That's Prager's advice. He also points out that one of the evils of immoral governments and crime-ridden societies is that people learn to trust no one. Isaac was successful as a farmer agriculturalist. He was not a shepherd or any of the other things. He's the only patriarch, in fact, who was a farmer. And he grew wealthy. He was very good at it. Good enough that the Philistines took note of it and got envious and stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of his father, Abraham, filling them in with earth, which of course ruins them, right? The lesson here, what's the lesson here? The lesson is, when you see someone being more successful than you are, you really have 2 choices about what you're going to do about that in regard to what yourself is going to do and think and act. You can either envy the person and let that drive you nuts and maybe make you do stuff like the Philistines did here, or you can choose to emulate what the successful person did. In other words, learn from them. Find out what it was that made them successful and do it yourself so that you too can become successful. This is one of the things in today's society that I think is overwhelmingly, maybe I shouldn't say that, but one of the many great issues. People tend to envy what others have rather than emulate in their own lives how those other people became successful or got what they wanted. In a bigger picture, it's probably a lot to do with envy that the Jewish people are so hated by some. The Jews have been successful, quite successful, particularly given how small they are percentage-wise. It's like 0.00 something percent of the population. They've been outrageously successful. And all of the rest of us circling around Judaism can look at that and either envy them and become jealous and try to take it away or steal it or stop it, or we can learn how to emulate. How did that happen? How did they do that? We want to learn how to do that. In this case, the Philistines could just as easily have learned from Isaac how to dig good wells than stop up the wells that Isaac had. When Esau was 40 years old, he took to a wife Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hittite. And they were a source of bitterness to Isaac and Rebekah. This is a clue, or a revelation, you might say, about Esau. This confirms to some degree, Esau was not a bad person. Before you get that idea, and it's made clear in the Torah through the end of the story that Esau was not a bad person. But this does confirm, in a way, his unworthiness for the God plan kind of stuff, that he takes wives from pagan tribes. He didn't get that memo, apparently. So he obviously wasn't quite as concerned as we learned earlier. He wasn't really all that fascinated or interested in the birthright. He sold it for stew and bread. Okay, chapter 27 opens with Isaac being near death and sending Esau, the hunter, out for some game. Remember, Esau was a lover of game, meaning meat eating. He tells Esau, or asks Esau, to bring him some game meat, and he will give him his innermost blessing, or maybe otherwise translated, deep from my soul, his birthright. This is pretty petty, if you think about it. We might expect more of a patriarch than to offer up his birthright, the part of God's plan birthright, to one of his sons who's not supposed to get it. But remember, Isaac hasn't been told that up till this point, unless Sarah has told him or God has told him, unbeknownst to us. Not recorded in the Torah, in other words. But this is the Torah, and it does not hide odd things or even things that might shed its characters in a bad light. Rebekah overhears Isaac asking Esau to go get him some meat and come back and get a blessing, and immediately plots with Jacob to fix things. That's what you see here in this slide and this verse. This is Rebekah talking to Jacob. Now, my son, Jacob, listen carefully as I instruct you. And she tells Jacob basically how to trick Isaac into giving him the blessing / birthright, not Esau. This is another big truth. Sometimes humans have to intervene in order to get God's will executed. And in this case, Rebekah is intervening with what Jacob might or probably would have done otherwise. Not only are humans expected or allowed to intervene or help, they're mandated. Humans are not allowed to do nothing and wait for God to act, at least as the Torah teaches it. It reminded Prager of the Jews who stood by, didn't do anything, while others tried to reestablish the Jewish nation in Israel, a movement that was referred to as Zionism. way back earlier in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, those same Jews, if still alive, um, probably saw the error of their ways in 1948 when Israel established statehood. And another interesting here, another point to be made, I suppose, in the claim that the Bible is not at all sexist. It's often in many of these Bible stories, the woman in the family is the strongest and the one who really pushes along God's plan. And that certainly is true here in the case of Rebekah. Okay, so here on Isaac's deathbed, or what amounts to his deathbed, he asks, Jacob is sitting there, that in this illustration, that's Jacob on the right, "Are you really my son Esau?" And then Jacob said, "I am." It was a flat out lie. And this should be disturbing to people when they first, particularly children hearing this story. This should sort of shake them up. He's lying. How can that be a good thing? Well, there is reason to believe this is a good thing, but it has to be explained. It's not clear just from the activity. One thing here that exonerates Jacob in a way is that by now, at least we all know this is God's plan, and presumably Rebekah has explained that to Jacob somewhere along the way, and particularly at the end there in instructing him what to do here. Jacob is following her instructions, which is another thing that tends to exonerate him. He was in a no-win situation. Does he listen to his mother and do this to trick Isaac into giving Jacob the birthright properly, or does he not lie to his father? One way or another, he's going to, at least on the surface, do wrong to one of them. Another thing, we already know that Jacob bought the birthright from Esau in a straight up deal. Whatever you think of it, there really wasn't anything nasty about how that happened. And Esau, we learned earlier, despised his birthright. So a lot of things come into play here to get the point across that lying sometimes is what you need to do. Morality is not clear-cut, absolutely identifiable all the time without describing what the situation is. In other words, situational ethics on top of a morality base. Everything is situationally important. Take the sex act, for instance. The sex act in a loving marriage is a beautiful thing. The sex act in rape, forced sex act, is not. It's the exact same act, basically, but it's the situation that determines whether it's moral or not. So, one of the big lessons here, another one besides when is something wrong or right, or really wrong or really right. Another thing is here, those who wish to do good in this world often have to get their hands dirty. And by dirty here, it's an allusion or a metaphor for lying in Jacob's case, for Rebekah and being so strong and a little bit deceitful in how she went about it. She got her hands dirty. Rebekah, though, made clear back in verse 13, she was willing to be judged for what she did. She believed that she was doing right by God, and she was willing to have God judge her for what she did. That's admirable. He had a dream. a stairway was set on the ground, and its top reached to the sky, and angels of God were going up and down on it, and the Lord was standing beside him. The word used for stairway here, by the way, could also be, the word stairway here could also be translated as ladder. It's also the only time in the Bible that this word is used. Another interesting thing to point out here is that about 2/3 of the way down, angels were going up and down, not down and up. Angels do not live in heaven, at least according to the Torah. The Torah describes angels as going up and back down. In other words, they live on earth. They are messengers. Sorry, folks who believe in the, if you believe in angels with wings and all that. So here in chapter 28, verse 15, remember, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. This verse and others that sound like it do not mean that we can expect God to protect us all the time. Even Jacob couldn't expect that. In fact, we all know by now Jacob suffers a lot too. He wasn't entirely protected. Probably this is referring to protecting you from your greatest fears, your own fears. Many people believe, though, that God is going to protect them from tragedy or suffering or what happens. And sadly, if you have that belief, you're often going to be disappointed. Even disappointed to the point where you might leave your faith based on it. It's a dangerous belief to have. And it's pretty clear in the Bible, God doesn't do a lot of direct protecting. In fact, generally speaking, I can't think of an exception offhand, but generally speaking, God protects people until their mission with God is accomplished, and that's it. After that, if they're still around, they're on their own. If you look at it a little deeper, protecting us all the time would be robbing us of freedom, right? Robbing us of consequences. Another problem with expecting protection all the time is if one decent person is protected, then everybody should, right? But if everybody should is protected, then we get back to that problem of removing free will. There's no consequences if anybody screws up. The path down the road of consequences was set when Adam and Eve chose to go with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. What can we expect of God if we can't expect protection all the time? We can expect God will honor his promises, and we can expect that there will be ultimate justice, which he has also promised. That's it. Jacob then made a vow, saying, if God remains with me, if he protects me on this journey that I am making and gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safe to my father's house, the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up as a pillar, shall be God's abode. And of all that you give me, I will set aside a tithe for you. A tithe being the Torah's 10% of your income should be given to the poor. This smacks of a deal, does it not? Jacob is trying to make a deal with God, which typically take the form either, God, you do something and then I'll do this, or how about if I do this and then you, God, do this? Making deals with God is not a sound approach, generally speaking, or trying to. Expecting to be rewarded for something is not a good approach, because it clearly doesn't happen all the time. It's not God's way. Some people say, if they keep the Sabbath holy every week after week after week, they could be rewarded with good health. Well, the problem is there's plenty of people who have been very good at keeping the Sabbath who are not healthy, die of terrible diseases, or chronically rot with something. And on the other hand, there are some people who don't observe the Sabbath or any other of God's laws particularly, and do extremely well, live forever, don't have much in the way of problems. As one writer in the Talmud, or a rabbinic scholar, somebody, I forget who, suggested the reward for keeping a commandment is the keeping of the commandment. It's its own reward. It has its own benefits to you. You don't get a reward for having an additional reward for having done that. People who believe this, that deals with God can work, usually end up disappointed, unhappy. In fact, to the extent that unhappiness in a person's life may very well be signs of problems with their religion or how they live it. Okay, moving on. So Jacob is journeying to find himself a wife, and he stops at a well, which was sort of the meeting place of the day. Wherever you go today to meet people, especially to meet people that you could conceivably come to marry, in those days you went to the well. And he finds out there that Laban, his uncle, Isaac's brother, is well, which is great, and meets Laban's daughter, Rachel, and falls in love at first sight. This is the only instance in the Torah of a man kissing someone other than his mother or wife. And the verse reads here, 29:11, then Jacob kissed Rachel and broke into tears. Tears, he's talking about kissing Rachel, the love aspect. So tears he could easily be overwhelmed from that. But he also just finished up a lengthy journey. So it would be even more likely when you realize that he's probably so grateful for having that journey over with, and combining that with meeting the love of his life, all happening at once at this well. You could say no wonder he broke into tears. So Leah also was Laban's, or Laban's, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, other daughter. So Leah and Rachel were sisters. And in the Bible, there's some comparisons here about how attractive they were. It says Leah had weak eyes. Weak could also mean soft. It could also mean she had poor vision. We're not sure. And we're also not sure if the Torah is comparing the beauty of both or contrasting one being beautiful and one not being beautiful. That's not really made clear here. But either way, it's pretty clear that Rachel seems to win the beauty contest, however it's going. The Torah is not a prudish book. It deals very directly with human sexuality. And one of the things it's trying to tell us here, and it reminds me, I was about to say the ugly truth, one of the ugly truths of life, just like the movie, if you ever saw it, called The Ugly Truth. It's about how men and women see each other. One of the ugly truths is that female beauty matters to men, particularly to the male. It's painful, it's unfair perhaps, but it's true. It's reality. If you're going to deal in reality, this is reality. Male looks, the look of a male, how a man looks, is also important to some degree. But it's not at all like in the animal kingdom. In the animal kingdom, of course, the male attracts the female with all their colors and puffery and so on. But in the human race, in the human being, it's the female that attracts the male. And physical beauty is the first thing a man notices. An incredibly strong, internally wired reaction that you're not going to fix. Nobody's going to fix. It's there. It's human nature, male human nature. Interestingly enough, the beauty of a woman is the first thing, or often the first thing, that other women notice as well and start chattering about in their little circle, perhaps. But it also makes it clear that here in the Torah, a man who loves a woman for her beauty doesn't really love her. So lest you think this gets carried away a little too far, it doesn't. But it's very important to understand that to the male, beauty does count. It leads to a conclusion by Prager that parents in society do no favors by telling young women that looks don't matter. In the real world of real human beings, female looks mean a lot to the male. The power of the visual in the male wiring is great. The force is great in that one, as they say. Okay, so so Jacob wants to marry. Shoot, I forgot. It just went out of my mind who this is. Rachel, I guess it is. So he goes to Laban, the father, and makes a deal to have Rachel be his bride. And the deal is that he would work for Laban for 7 years. So they make the deal, the feast is had, and Isaac heads off to bed, presumably with Rachel as his new bride. Well, here's the verse then that comes along. When morning came, there was Leah, not Rachel. So he goes back and says to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I was in your service for Rachel. Why did you deceive me?" And there are all kinds of questions arise in your head, right? The first one probably being, how in the world could Jacob be fooled? Did he not recognize Leah somehow or another, or at least recognize that it wasn't Rachel? It was a primitive time and a primitive place. There probably wasn't a great deal of good lighting. He may well have not been able to see, or he might have been basically blind. But you would think he would recognize the voice, something. So it is kind of an odd situation. Another possibility, maybe he was inebriated from the feast, the wedding feast. Remember the Torah's general rule about be careful with alcohol. That could be at play here too. There's also kind of an illusory part to this. Many people sleep with illusions or come to believe in illusions that they're not really paying attention to what it will lead to or what it really is. So that may be well at play here. He's just not paying attention at all. This also could be something of a what goes around comes around thing, hearkening back to when Jacob deceived Isaac with blindness. Remember, Jacob pretended he was Esau when Isaac was on his deathbed to make sure he got his birthright. So Jacob deceived Isaac when Isaac couldn't see him. Here, Laban and Leah deceive Jacob in what you might kind of call a blindness of sorts, where he couldn't see. So what does he do? Well, he's already married Leah and consummated that wedding or marriage, so he's bound to that. But he also then goes and makes a deal with Laban to by Rachel again as a wife and work another 7 years, which is accomplished. They do that. And as we leave chapter 29, Leah has had several children. Rachel hasn't had any yet. When Rachel saw that she had borne Jacob no children, she became envious of her sister. And Rachel said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." Abraham expressed similar feelings. If I can't have a child, I'm not worth anything. I will die, or I might as well be dead. This is a sentiment that many women have, and many women have had in most societies throughout history. There's some interesting things here, including there's the fact that there are two words for woman in Hebrew. Isha means, or has the connotation of taken from man, can advance in anything a man can do. That's Isha. The other one is Shava or Chava, I'm not sure, Chava, mother of all things, which men cannot do. So this is the other side, the birth giving side. But under Isha, that first one, where men and women are basically equal in terms of being able to accomplish anything, a barren woman is just as capable of achievements or anything as a man, which includes having a meaningful life without children. So that's the Torah's view of being childless. That doesn't stop you from having plenty of opportunity and ability to do good. Ironically, interestingly enough here, Rachel is saying, if I don't have children, I shall die. But the truth is, she does have children and she does die. She dies in childbirth to her second child. It's kind of ironic. This is a mandrake, a plant. The balance of chapter 30 is all about Leah and Rachel wanting children, having them through concubines, buying rights to lie with another, with mandrakes at their side. Mandrakes are supposed to be have powers that would enhance sexual pleasure and induce pregnancy. And the reason this is in this story is for God to make another point, for the Torah to make another point, that it's foolishness to believe in nature gods or idols or any of these supposedly powerful things. And how does he do that in this story? The one who is exposed to the mandrake does not get pregnant, and the other one does. Okay, so by the end of the chapter, this chapter 30, Rachel has Joseph. And the word, interesting, the name Joseph means he will add, because Rachel wanted another, right? Jacob wants to leave Laban's land. Laban acknowledges what Jacob had done for him, the 2 cycles of 7 years to purchase the wives and so on, which of the wives didn't get anything out of that either. Laban basically kept all the wealth that Jacob had worked to build for him. And Laban is sort of making amends here in a way, offering Jacob all kinds of stuff. But Jacob says, no, I don't need any more payment. I just want to take what I've earned and go. But ultimately, Laban convinces Jacob to take something, and Jacob agrees to take all the spotted animals. There's not very many of them. There's few of them, which is all well and good, except that darn Laban, before Jacob has a chance to pick from the flock, goes out into the flock overnight and removes as many of the spotted animals as he could, so that Jacob's choices are even further reduced. But nonetheless, of course, Jacob goes with the choicest animals, even though they're very few in number, and Jacob Jacob prospered from the deal. Meanwhile, meaning while this is all going on, Laban went out to shear his sheep, and Jacob is off preparing to leave, we can understand. Rachel steals from her father's household idols to take with her on the journey, and she does take them with her. There could be a number of reasons for this. She might be trying to get something out of Laban that she didn't get, that she thought she was owed, like part of the value of all those 14 years of Jacob's work. Another theory is maybe she had learned enough about the one true God from Jacob that she was trying to wean or remove idols from her father's household to make Laban a better person. But if that's the case, you got to wonder why she didn't just bury it or dispose of it some other way to keep it from him rather than take it with her. Why take it with her? She also might well still have believed in pagan gods. It happened a lot, particularly back in the day. In fact, there's a word for it, syncretism. It's the merging of pagan beliefs with belief in a one true God. It's sort of like straddling the fence a little bit, quote unquote, not taking any chances. There was a story Prager shared about Niels Bohr, a famous physicist, was once asked why he kept a rabbit's foot on his desk. You wouldn't expect a real physicist type scientist to believe in any kind of voodoo like a rabbit's foot being good luck. And the guy asked Niels Bohr, "You don't believe in that, do you?" And he replies, "Of course not, but they say it works whether you believe in it or not." I thought that was just kind of cute. Okay, this is where we ended last night. We didn't quite make it all the way